In this video, I'm going to give my understanding of the Lord's Prayer. This is the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples and that Christians pray to this day. I could have called the video simply our commentary on the Lord's Prayer. I could have called it a GP Xavier commentary, but those titles wouldn't have been too helpful. So I had to call it something, so I chose to call it a Vitalist Nontheist commentary, and those terms aren't perfect. But here's what they mean in the context of the video. So vitalism usually means an affirmation of this life, of life as it is. In the context of this video, what I mean is that this life is all that there is. This life, this reality is life, is reality, and so we're not looking toward a radically different kind of reality or a radically different kind of life to come. Whether that be in heaven or in a new world after the resurrection or something like that. So I'm excluding that. It doesn't mean that sort of life values or the values of life or the values of nobility or something like that are the highest values and that there's no spiritual values or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that life is the arena in which values are realized, and life has the qualities that we identify right here and now. In this life that we're living. Non-theist is a broad term. It can encompass many different religions, philosophies, approaches. It's trying to get outside that dichotomy of theist versus atheist. Theism being there's one personal God who created the universe, who rules the universe, and atheism simply being the rejection of that or the denial of that. So non-theistic philosophies can look very different. A common example of a non-theistic philosophy or religion is Buddhism, in which there is a sense of the sacred. There is a sense of the value of, if you will, the absolute. But it's not a personal being. And in a way, it's not even a being. It's the emptiness, the luminous emptiness at the base of reality, which one realizes when one realizes nirvana. And so these are very religious concepts. They're concepts informed by the sacred, the idea of the sacred, but they're not theistic concepts. And so in this video, I'm using non-theist to mean that the ground of being, which is holy, which is sacred, is non-personal, is not in itself a personal being. So here's the prayer. We find it in the Bible in two places. We find it in Matthew and we find it in Luke. There's a shorter version in Luke, and in Matthew it's given to the disciples in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the traditional English translation, so there are translations that vary a little bit. In the biblical text in Matthew, debt is used in place of trespass, although trespass is used in the verses immediately after the prayer. But yeah, basically they're all very similar. And so this is the version I'm most familiar with, so this is the one that I'm using. So here's the prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So there's some interesting tensions within the prayer, at least as I see it, and I'll get into those in a moment. But first I just need to give a very brief overview or outline of these two different levels that I see at play. It won't make a whole lot of sense to begin with, but it will make sense as we go through the prayer. So first of all, there's the absolute level. So this is the level of the non-personal ground of being that I'm talking about, what it is in itself, so to speak. And the way I think of it, that makes a lot of sense to me, is that this is the good beyond good and evil. This is a good that embraces both good and evil. And I got this idea partly from Ian McGilchrist. So he talks about that in relation to the two hemispheres of the brain. The right hemisphere, which is holistic, which can understand context, can encompass or embrace the left hemisphere, which is specific, focused attention, a very logical, rigorous manner, but for that reason somewhat myopic. The left hemisphere can't acknowledge the world and the importance and the value of the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere can acknowledge the left hemisphere. It can see that it has a place. And so there's an asymmetric relationship between the brain hemispheres. In his recent book, The Matter with Things, which is a 2-volume book, in the second volume where he talks about the sacred, he talks about, this is on page 1300, he talks about the relationship between good and evil having a similar structure. So he says that, and this is not a verbatim quote, but he says that love and good can embrace, they're able to embrace hate and evil. So there's still an opposition. These good and evil are still opposites. The left hemisphere exists in an opposition to the right hemisphere, but one of these is privileged, right? One of these is, in a certain sense, deeper, even though there is a real opposition. And so this is how I see the ground of being relating to the good and evil in the world, or the goodness of the ground of being is relating to the particular things that we call good and evil in this world. And you'll note that I've put a capital G for one good and a lowercase g for the other. That will recur throughout this video, because we can see it as good embraces evil, but we can see it, I think, more accurately as saying that there's a level in which good and evil oppose each other, and there's a level in which good has no opposition because it embraces its opposite. And the level that we exist on is the level, in most respects, right? The level that human beings exist on is where there's good and evil in opposition. But the level that the ground of being, which sort of manifests or emanates all being, exists on, is wholly good. And we can recognize that in the experience of the holy, Holy, whereas before I used holy as in complete, but we can recognize that in the experience of the holy or the sacred. The holy and the sacred do not have to be benign, beneficent phenomena. They can be terrifying phenomena. They can be overpowering phenomena. But they give us a sense of awe, they give us a sense of extreme value. So the absolute, the non-personal ground of being is good in this way. And because it gives rise to the whole world participates in this kind of goodness. And so we can say on the one hand that the ground of being is good in itself with a capital G. We can say in another sense that all the phenomena of the world, whatever actually happens, is good with a capital G because it participates in this, because it comes from this. And we can sort of see that when we just look at things and say, it's wonderful that you exist. Whatever they may be, however they may have aspects that are disagreeable to us or not as particular creatures. And then we also have the particular goods in our lives, like the good that we can do instead of evil, the good actions, the virtuous actions we can do instead of vicious actions, the goods that we want and need as human creatures, right? The things that make us flourish, as opposed to the evils that disintegrate us or make us that destroy us in some way. And so those exist in opposition. The good, with a capital G, actually grounds the lowercase g good or goods, in the sense that because reality is of one piece, because life is of one piece and everything adheres in it, good and bad, the goodness that creates this life, that creates this world, affords all lowercase g goodness. And if it wasn't for that manifestation of goodness as reality, as life, there would be no scope for the realization of lowercase g goods. There would be no scope for that. There would be no ability for that to be realized. And so in that sense as well, good encompasses both good and evil. This absolute level is the level of the complete affirmation of all things. Everything proceeds from the ground of being. Everything participates in its goodness. Everything is intrinsically good. And so this is the level of complete affirmation of all things. This is sort of the Nietzschean affirmation of reality, of life as it is. The second level is the relative level. On this level, we have the personal God. This is a way of relating to the ground of being. We are personal beings, and we relate. We're very good at relating to other people, and we're very good at relating to things in a personal way. And so this is one way, a very potent way of relating to the ground of being, is by construing it as a person. Now, that's not to say that that's purely subjective. I would tend to see that it's happening in between the ground of being and ourselves. It's not merely just a personal, subjective, particular projection, but it has some kind of reality. At the same time, it exists in relation to us as human beings. To conceive of God as the Father presupposes human beings and all the experience that they have of father-child relationships. It also supposes human beings and just having interpersonal relationships. But the ground of being itself is beyond all this. And yet, having that relationship can bring us into contact with it. This is the level of good versus evil, where there's a strict opposition between the two. And that's what I've just been talking about. I don't think there's anything else to say there. It's also the level of personal petition, which is present in this prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. Deliver us from evil. It's the level of struggle. We actually have to struggle to realize the good and resist the evil. It's the level of improvement. We can get better and better and better. Whereas if we consider the world as a whole, the whole universe as a manifestation of the ground of being, it's already perfect and there's nothing to achieve. So we'll go through line by line or petition by petition through the prayer. So the first lines, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So in this very first petition, we notice a couple of interesting things. First of all, it's our Father. So this is the personal form of God that we're invoking here, our Father who art in heaven. So a father is a very particular kind of person with a particular kind of relationship to his children. We're not born out of the father in the same way we are as the mother. We don't emerge from the father's body. So the father has a certain distance. We don't feed at the breast of the father either. And so the father is already as a metaphor or as a form of God, something that is distant from us. And this emphasizes the transcendence of the ground of being. This almost in itself emphasizes the fact that we're thinking through a metaphor towards something that's more fundamental, or reaching through a metaphor to something that's more fundamental, because we're not just thinking, we're reaching and we're engaging. At the same time, it's an intensely personal relationship, right? The father and the child. And so in that way, we're back on the relative level. We're on the level of form, and we're on the level of relationship. And so this is what we're invoking. We're invoking the loving Father who, yes, is distant from us because he's in heaven. So there's a distance there, even within the concrete metaphor. But nonetheless, he can hear us and he can act in our favor. Hallowed be thy name. So I'm going to talk about hallowed in a minute, but I want to just focus on thy name, because here we already have a almost explicit distinction between our Father in himself and the name of the Father. So the name is what connects us to God. The name of something is what connects us to something. And so it mediates. And that's particularly essential in the case of the ground of being, which resists in itself all names and transcends all characterizations. Yet to approach it and to engage with it and to gain any kind of contact with it in our awareness, as opposed to the contact that we already have in our being, but to gain any kind of awareness of it, we have to have some sort of thing that goes between. And that is precisely the personal conception of God, and the particular personal conception here, our Father. Hallowed be thy name. So it's already implying that there is this sort of separation within our conception of God between God himself and the name of God. We're not saying simply, may you be hallowed yourself, but we're saying, may your name be hallowed. Of course, at the same time, we're saying, may you be hallowed. The name and the person whose name it is are identical in a sense, even if they're separate in a different sense. Hallowed. So hallowed, to hallow something means to recognize its holiness. And so that's the primary meaning here. Now I'm going to bring Simone Weil into this. Simone Weil was a 20th century French philosopher, French Jewish philosopher, although her upbringing wasn't religiously Jewish, so she grew up very, very secular and very atheistic, essentially, until she had an encounter with Christ, until she had a mystical experience of God. And even then she insisted on the value of atheism, but she knew from experience the reality of God. And she's a very interesting figure. I think that she's got vitalist elements in my sense of vitalist. Usually we wouldn't describe Simone Weil as a vitalist, but I think there's an interesting overlap. And she's also a bit of a nontheist. This is despite her intensely personal experiences with Christ. She did tend to insist on the non-personal nature of God and even the non-personal nature of the person. That which is truly sacred in a person is his non-personal aspect. Simone Weil has been, a considerable influence for me, and I think particularly in my understanding of the Lord's Prayer. And so that's why I'm bringing her into this, to emphasize something which maybe isn't so emphasized in Christian understandings of the prayer. And this is what she says. So first of all, she talks in her letters about how she began to recite the Our Father, which is the Lord's Prayer, and how it basically induced mystical experiences in her. It sounds like pretty much on a daily basis. Which is really wonderful. I was originally going to read the quote that talks about her experience with the prayer, but in the interests of time, I'm not. But you can find it in the volume Waiting for God, which includes her letters, some of her letters, and which also includes this essay here concerning the Our Father, where she actually goes through petition by petition, like I'm doing, and explains her understanding of the prayer. Now, my understanding of the prayer does not completely align with hers. It has more. It has extra bits which she wouldn't approve of because they're too relative, whereas she really emphasizes the absolute. And so just to make it clear, my understanding of the prayer is not the same as Weil's. But here's what she says about this petition. Quote, "This name is holiness itself. There is no holiness outside it. It does not therefore have to be hallowed. In asking for its hallowing, we are asking for something that exists eternally, with full and complete reality, so that we can neither increase nor diminish it, even by an infinitesimal fraction. To ask for that which exists really, infallibly, eternally, quite independently of our prayer, that is the perfect petition." So, what she's basically saying is that in this part of the prayer, we are asking for that which already exists, and which exists more surely than anything else in the world, which is the holiness of God. So we're asking for God to be holy. And in the passage that follows this, again, I didn't want to include everything in the interests of time, but in the passage that immediately follows the passage I quoted, She basically describes it as a kind of crucifixion. She doesn't use that term, but she does use it elsewhere. A kind of crucifixion to bring your desires into alignment with what is. And so to do that is to kind of give up being a creature and return yourself to God. And so on the absolute level, this is what's going on in this prayer, I think. Hallowed be your name. Hallowed be thy name. May you be holy. But of course, as God, as the absolute, you are holy. And so we're asking, be what you are. We're affirming that which is, and we're affirming God, and we're directing our minds to the holiness of God. But there's other levels, and so the second level is simply saying, may your holiness be recognized. And this is more in the traditional Christian interpretation of this. Hallowed be thy name is oriented to the future. May your name be hallowed. May your name be recognized as holy by the whole world, by everyone, as it should be. And remember, here we're talking about the ground of being, and we're talking about the personal God, or this particular form of God. That gets interesting if you believe that there are many possible forms of God. Because what you're asking for is the recognition of the holiness of this form, but actually of all forms and all ways that God manifests in the world. On another level, we're asking, may your holiness be manifested more fully. So we're not just asking that people may recognize God's holiness, but we're also saying, God, from your side, if you will, from your side, please manifest your holiness more fully. Please make yourself present in the world more fully. And please, manifest your holiness, your sacredness in this world in a way that is more recognizable and more clear and more potent and powerful. And then finally, and this is the same case with a lot of these petitions, we're also implicitly saying, we will recognize and we will help to manifest your holiness. Thy kingdom come. So similarly to the previous petition, there's a sense in which God is the ground of being. His kingdom is already everything, everywhere. It's complete. All is God's will. And so therefore all is good. All comes from the absolute good, and all participates in the absolute good. All is good. And so this is God's kingdom. We live in it. And his kingdom is complete. His kingdom has come. And so again, you can read the absolute on the absolute level, on the first level, we're just saying, may what is be. And we're taking ourselves away from our relative, particular desires and aversions, and we're bringing ourselves to the level of the absolute. But there is the relative levels operating in this prayer as well. We're saying your kingdom is not yet realized because it's opposed by evil and furthered by good. So this is very much the personal level and the relative level. We're imagining God as a king. And kings have opposition. They don't have the absolute, complete, unqualified control that the ground of being does on being. And so on this level, we're saying, may your kingdom come. May it has not fully manifested. May it manifest more fully. But what are we talking about here? So we're not talking about the absolute goodness of things or the absolute goodness of the source of things. We're talking about good with a lowercase g, which is intimately connected to the good with a capital G, but is not quite the same thing, at least from our perspective. And so this is the good that can be opposed by evil. And so on the third level, I'll jump to the third level and then I'll elucidate what I mean by what I'm saying in terms of kingdom. So on the third level, as with all these petitions, we're saying, we will help to bring your kingdom. So this is, thy kingdom come means please bring it, but it also means we will actively help to do it. It means I'm orienting my consciousness towards this task, towards helping. So what is the kingdom then? So apart from the fact that the kingdom is the entire cosmos without exception, the other level is that the kingdom is something specific. If we think of earthly kingdoms, if we think of societies, we can recognize that there are many different kinds of societies, and they're all societies. They're not something else. They hold together. They haven't completely disintegrated. but they hold together and they have a certain identity. And yet there are better societies and there are worse societies. There are some where there's a lot of flourishing, a lot of prosperity, a lot of peace, and there's some which have immense dysfunction. And so you could say the same thing about families, and you could say the same kind of thing about human bodies. There's healthy human bodies and there's diseased human bodies, and yet both are human bodies. And in fact, the diseased ones might even be able to live for the entire lifespan that a healthy body would, but just in a worse way. So it's not even saying that they're like disintegrating or anything like that. But there's a clear difference between good and bad. And so this is what we're saying here. We're saying, may your kingdom come. May the good be manifest in the world in a way that is where it predominates over evil. May the maximal amount of good possible be manifest in the world. That's what we're asking for, and manifest in our individual souls as well, which is to say a very similar thing because the two are intertwined. And so that's what we're actually asking for here. We don't know the limits of goodness. We only know that it can increase. So we are aware that we can do better. We can always do better. And there's always evils that we're doing in some subtle way or in sometimes obvious ways that we could stop doing, and that we could decrease. And there's always good things that we could increase. There's always the possibility of increasing our mindset that's more innately good, so it's more innately good. And so this will become relevant when we talk about the forgiveness petition. But for now, that's all we need to think about. God's kingdom is fully here. God is ground of being. But the God that exists in relation to us calls us to realize the good and preference to the evil. And yet, at the same time, because this is a Vitalist nontheist commentary, this does not presuppose the eradication of evil. In fact, it presupposes that evil is constitutive of reality, and yet, within reality, as embodied particular beings and as human beings, we genuinely should realize the good. It's not just a relativism. We're not just saying everything is relative, but we're saying if you're this particular kind of being, then that value is real. That value is unavoidable, that you should realize the good and avoid the evil. And so we can think of this as God's specific will for us, as opposed to a general will which realizes all things. There's a specific will for us as these particular beings that exists when we consider God in this personal way. It exists otherwise. We don't need to think of God in a personal way to be aware that we could be better or worse, or that we should pursue virtue as opposed to vice. But if we consider God in a personal way, we become conscious of particular requirements that he's placing on us. Moral requirements. And we can be conscious of the fact that we can help to manifest his kingdom. Now, the kingdom that's manifest, let's imagine the maximal expansion of good and the minimum of evil. It won't eradicate evil. So if we think of real kingdoms in the world, and we think of the most flourishing kingdom possible, with the most freedom and the most peace and the most prosperity and whatever other things that we value, we'll find that it still has hierarchy, and it still has coercion, and it still has kind of like a defense force. It still has, all that make a society possible. It still has parents that discipline their children in order to raise them. And so it's not perfect in the sense of just like everyone. No, I mean, I don't even think in this way. I don't even think of this as being perfect. But, if you have a particular progressive frame of mind, you might think it's perfect to sort of have everyone absolutely equal and sort of just living freely without any pressure against each other or something like that. That's not what we're talking about there. That's just not possible. And so God's kingdom, to the extent that it manifests in every aspect of being, body, soul, society, is similar. It's not the elimination of good, it's the maximization of relative sorry, it's not the elimination of evil, but it's the maximization of relative good. And there's often a limit that we can actually find when we're pursuing good, lowercase g, where we realize we actually tip into evil. We would be doing that if we tried to raise a child without any discipline at all, right? Because we would actually ruin the child and they wouldn't grow up into a well-adjusted human being. And so that would be actively evil. And so sometimes we can find those limits. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So this is similar to talking about the kingdom, but it's talking about God's will. So I'm going to quote from Vey again. This is what she says in her essay on the Our Father. She says, "We are only absolutely infallibly certain of the will of God concerning the past. Everything that has happened, whatever it may be, is in accordance with the will of the Almighty Father. That is implied by the notion of almighty power. The future also, whatever it may contain, once it has come about, will have come about in conformity with the will of God." And there's one more quote that I want to read by her. This occurs in the same essay just a little bit further on. She says, "We must," quote, "make every accomplished fact, whatever it may be, an object of desire. We have here quite a different thing from resignation. Even the word acceptance is too weak. We have to desire that everything that has happened should have happened and nothing else. We have to do so not because what has happened is good in our eyes, but because God has permitted it, and because the obedience of the course of events to God is in itself an absolute good." End quote. What's amazing about this quote is the sense in which it's so close to Nietzsche. It's basically, in a sense, saying the same thing as Nietzsche. We're not talking about resignation. We're not talking about mere acceptance. We're talking about positive desire and positive actual affirmation of what has been. And he talks about this in the context of eternal return. And yet also it's in the opposite end of the opposite extreme to Nietzsche. And I don't think Vey liked Nietzsche very much. And her whole approach to life is, dispositionally at least, opposed to Nietzsche. But it's interesting that they reach the same place, For Nietzsche, it's not, the self isn't something that is to be kind of denigrated and subdued and cast away, but is something joyful and to be celebrated. For Vey, it is in fact something that we want to escape from. But they reach the same conclusion, interestingly, in this regard, that we have to affirm everything, or that we ideally at least should affirm everything. I wouldn't say we have to affirm everything, but the ideal would be affirmation of everything. On the topic of self, it gets a little bit complicated too, because the Dionysian is also a transcending of self as well, but in a different phenomenological kind of context, one of self-abandon and joy rather than asceticism. And so, but, there's many interesting similarities there. The reason that I brought this up at all is that it's the same kind of thing that we saw before. This is Vey emphasizing the absolute level. Thy will be done means your will is done. Your will is completely and infallibly done. All is your will, and we affirm your will, and we affirm you, and so we therefore, by implication, affirm everything that is. So when we say, thy will be done in the prayer, I think that's a very real element of it, is that we're saying, whatever you will, may your will be done. And yet at the same time, on the relative level, at the very same time, in the very same breath, we're saying, may your will for us, that is the good that we might realize, may that be done, because it is not yet done. And when I say the good we might realize, I'm talking about both the good that we could do and the good that we could receive, or the good that we could experience. And so we're asking for God's good will to be done in specific relation to us and in us, which is the third level, which is we will do our bit. We will strive to do your will. And so it can work on those, it engages with every level of our being, right? And so it can work on that at the same time. We can affirm everything, and within that overall affirmation, that existential or ontological affirmation, we can particularly affirm a particular good in contradistinction to a particular evil. And we can do both because we're complex beings, we're multi-leveled beings, and we're not just simple. On earth as it is in heaven. So heaven is ideality, and earth is the arena of reality, and it's the only arena in which things can come to be. So there are different ways that we could approach this. We could say that when the prayer says, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," it's saying heaven is completely, and it completely obeys your will, but earth for some reason resists it, and we want to make earth into heaven. We want to change earth into heaven because we want earth to be as obedient to your will as possible, as heaven is. Now, heaven is ideality. So what I mean by that is that it's kind of like Plato's form. So when we're thinking of like the form of justice, the form of courage, etc., etc., when we're kind of presenting those to our minds, we can kind of present them to ourselves as concepts at least, or as directions or as dispositions in a somewhat pure and individual way. They can orient us. But when we instantiate them in the world, when we actually do a specific action that is just, or establish a particular institution that is just, or act with courage, we find there's not only incredible complexity, but there's an interdependence between all phenomena. So that for justice to actually be instantiated in the world, we need to perhaps use or invoke injustice. And for courage, we maybe need to invoke fear. For instance, maybe to be courageous, we need to fear shame more than we fear the thing that we're trying to face, or that we at least want to fear being cowardly, knowing ourselves as cowardly, or whatever the case may be. The point is that there's just this, in reality, there's this inextricableness of virtue with vice, and of what we consider good and what we consider bad. They're all bound up together. That doesn't mean that the good can't predominate in sometimes and the bad predominate in others. There's clearly differences there. But what we're saying is we can't escape the whole setup. And so the other interpretation of this verse would be, when we're praying, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're not saying transform earth into heaven, but we're saying may earth participate in heaven. May earth participate in these values and in these virtues in such a way that it's transformed for the better without ceasing to be earth, without ceasing to be life, without ceasing to be reality. Give us this day our daily bread. So here we're into the second part of the prayer. So the first part of the prayer, the first three petitions, were directed to God. May thy kingdom come, thy will be done, hallowed be thy name. And now we're focusing back on ourselves in a way. And so the first thing we're asking for is our daily bread, what we need. So literal food that sustains us, but also, everything we psychologically need, everything that we need each day. And this expresses, so one thing it does is it expresses our ultimate need and dependence. So we're not self-subsistent. We're not the ground of being in ourselves, in our particular egos. And we're not in control of everything. And so it expresses our ultimate need and dependence in this way. And in doing so, it connects us to the ground of being. So particularly to the ground of being as Father, as the Father that provides bread for his children. And so actually calling out in this way, recognizing our dependence, recognizing our vulnerability, and calling out in this way to the Father, which is ultimately to say to the ground of all being, connects us to the ground of being. It emotionally and mentally and spiritually connects us, brings us into relationship with the ground of being, with the Absolute. And so that's why this is so incredibly important, because when I wondered about this part of the prayer, because I wondered about its kind of particularity, it's relative to me, it's not sort of purely absolute, right? We're not just asking for God's holiness, which already exists in God completely, but we're actually asking for our daily bread. And it may be answered, and it may not be answered, but we're also making a real prayer. Generally, we don't have to do it like this, in the sense that we could use this just to get ourselves into a certain mindset, which in itself would be incredibly helpful. But I do think that prayers are answered. I believe in miracles. I believe in magic. I believe that these are part of reality. So a non-theist might scratch his head and say, well, why do you believe in all these other things that seem to come from a world beyond? But I would just simply say that these are part of the reality that we experience. Most people have experienced something very unusual, something like this. And people who do pray and people that do kind of divination or magic or whatever it may be, they do see how that has a certain reality. And so I would say all of this is just part of reality. Psi research presupposes that it's part of reality, not that it's some kind of something that just sort of impinges on our world in some way and has no basis in it and no interdependence with it. And so I would say it's similar like this. Like, prayer is actually efficacious, or at least it's potentially efficacious. We can't use it as we can sort of use a mechanism to just produce results. But it is something important. There is something about connecting ourselves consciously with the ground of being through the medium or through the mediating form of Father or whatever it may be, and giving it and putting our requests there in this vulnerable stance that is fruitful in a practical way as well as in a spiritual way. And so that's what I'd say about this. So this is what I love about this prayer, is that it embraces the personal and the relative as well as the absolute. And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And so there's two levels in which this works. And I'll talk about the relative first in this case. So on the relative level, it's clear that we always sort of exist in the state of guilt, you could say, if you want to see it like this. You could say that we're always guilty because we're always, if we look at ourselves and we look at our situation honestly, there's good that we could be doing that we're not doing, and there's evil that we could be avoiding that we're not avoiding, or that we're not sufficiently avoiding. And so in that sense, we're always falling short. And I'm just talking about the relative good that we could realize, and the relative evil that we could avoid. What God wants for us. So I talked before about maybe there's the general will of God, which is everything that occurs, and then the specific will of God, which is something that emerges out of our relation as an individual being with God, which is what we could do as a human being, and often as well what we could do as an individual, as us, as this particular person that we are. What we could do and what we should do and what we're not doing. And so if we are putting ourselves in relationship to the absolute and in relationship to the ground of being, that sense of guilt needs to be overcome. And so we ask God to forgive us. We ask God to forgive us for falling short of what we should do, and of trespassing, of doing what we should not do on that relative level. And that's necessary. That sort of clears the way for us to connect to God. But it comes with a catch, or it's not a catch, but it's a condition, which is that we actually have to forgive others. If we refuse to forgive others, we essentially condemn ourselves, because we know that we're the same as other people. There is differences. We might be better, we might be more virtuous objectively, or we might be less so, or whatever the case may be. There's differences. Everyone isn't the same, but we have the same essential nature, and all of us are doing things that we shouldn't do, and all of us are leaving undone things that we should do. And so in that sense, we're all the same, and we all participate in guilt, and so we all need forgiveness. And so we should be prepared to forgive everyone for everything the moment that they repent. Ideally, there are certain psychological limitations that are very hard for human beings to get over, which I also have, which can impede that. We should at least pray for the overcoming of those limitations. And to the extent that we're able to do that, then we're able to be conscious of the forgiveness that God freely gives us. And so that's the importance of this part of the prayer. On a deeper level, though, on the absolute level, we could see it in two different ways. If we want to continue to use the moralistic language, the language of the level of morality that we exist in terms of evil and good, we could say that everything, the whole creation, is guilty, and that God continually, without ceasing, without interval, forgives everything all the time for being. So I'm not talking about the evil that we could avoid. I'm talking about the evil that's constitutive of reality. But we could also see it in a different way. We could also see creation as being absolutely innocent and not needing forgiveness. The creation that proceeds from God, in all its forms. The lion that tears the lamb apart and causes it to die in agony is as glorious and innocent a creation as the lamb itself and as every other being. So on this level, there's this sort of this complete innocence, or if we want to see it from the human level, we can see it as being guilt that is continually and constantly forgiven. And so we can participate in that forgiveness, at least in relation to other people, through being ready as soon as they repent to forgive them and to wipe away the guilt of that action and the need to kind of compensate for it or something like that. And lead us not into temptation. And then the next line is, but deliver us from evil. But I'll take them one by one. And lead us not into temptation. So this is a very human prayer, again, just like give us this day our daily bread. Lead us not into temptation. I believe that the Greek in the Bible is something more like trial or testing. But temptation and testing are kind of the same basic idea. Temptation being sort of tempted by pleasure or tested by pleasure, and the trial being tested by pain or by something that you're averse to. And so this is what we want to avoid. Now, obviously, we don't always want to avoid that, and some of us actually like to put ourselves into positions of testing more than others, and everyone should do this to some extent because this is how we grow, right? If we put ourselves in a position where we need to use our virtues and need to grow and need to overcome. So this is very good, but we're all aware that there are positions that we could be in, whether it be sort of trial or whether it be temptation, where we know that we probably wouldn't stand up to the test, or that we're at least very uncertain whether we would. And it's these situations that we pray God not to lead us into. And so that's the prayer. Again, it's putting ourselves in a position of humility, and it's putting ourselves in a position of vulnerability, and it's calling out to the ground of our being, conceived of as a father, and connecting with him. What's interesting about this is that it seems that in the Bible, God really does lead people into temptation. I hear this part of the prayer being talked about sometimes as though maybe there's some kind of translation issue or misunderstanding about what Jesus meant because God doesn't lead people into temptation. But I don't see that myself when I look at the Bible. If we just look at this verse, for instance, Matthew 4:1, then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The Spirit obviously being the Holy Spirit of God. That's almost as close as you can get to just simply saying that God tempted Jesus. And so there is a sense in which God leads people into temptation, and yet we also at the same time pray not to be led into temptation. There's also a day when our daily bread won't be given, because there's a day that we will die, right? And so we also have to be conscious of that, and yet we should still continue to pray for these things, because these things are part of our nature as relative individual particular beings. And that is the way that we must connect to the ultimate reality. It is, as long as we feel like we're relative beings, we should lean into that and ask for the things that we need. So we ask not to be led into temptation. You could also see the whole crucifixion as being a temptation or a trial or a test, which God leads Jesus into, and which, of course, in which he's victorious, just like he was in the wilderness. But nonetheless, it's an extreme test. And in fact, Jesus prays in Gethsemane, "Take the cup from me, take the cup away from me, yet not what I will, but what you will," which itself is like a mini instantiation of the Lord's Prayer as a whole, which is wonderful. Wonderful, but also terrible or terrifying at the same time, because I could not do what Jesus did, at least without the grace of God. So that's lead us not into temptation. And then finally we're at, "But deliver us from evil," the last petition of the prayer. Now, this means, the evils that happen to us, like the evils that we're afflicted by, as well, presumably, as moral evils that we do or that other people do to us. But it could also just be natural evils, right? Disease, poverty, etc., etc. Ultimately, evil is necessary. It's ineradicable from reality. It's ineradicable from life. Ultimately, it's necessary. And yet we need to have a particular relationship to it. As these beings that we are, we need to have a particular relationship to it. And it's a completely natural one to want to avoid it. And it's a completely, for our purposes, good one to not want to commit it, to avoid committing it. So while it's necessary, it's for God to handle, for the most part. God is the good that embraces good and evil, and so God can deal with evil and does deal with evil. And so we shouldn't get into a mindset in which we sort of like choose to do evil because it sort of is part of reality, so why not? Otherwise we'd just be denying one part of reality. That tends to lead in very quickly in a very bad direction, in a very bad way. And so we don't want to do that. We understand that we're always dealing with evil ourselves in some way, but we're not doing it in the same way that we're dealing with good. We're pursuing good, we're striving for good, we're embracing good, and we don't have that same relationship with evil. Although I would also say that we don't want to simply cut evil out of the picture and deny evil and say there's no way that evil participates in our actions or something like that either. We want to understand that evil is partly constitutive of reality. Now, there's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from Job, the book of Job, and I've done a wonderful talk with Aron Van Os where we talk about the book of Job and how we understand it. And one thing I get from the book of Job is that this idea that only God can handle evil. God talks about when he appears in the whirlwind to Job, he talks about how he created these creatures, Leviathan and Behemoth, these monsters, these wondrous, overpowering monsters. And he talks about how humans can't handle Leviathan. They literally can't capture and tame Leviathan. But God can. God made him. God plays with Leviathan. And so I think it's a similar thing here. In regards to evil, we should have this relationship to Leviathan. And we should pray to God, deliver us from Leviathan. We shouldn't embrace Leviathan or think that we can deal with him on our own terms. And so there's another saying from Job here, which I've put on the screen. This is a quote, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." This is Hebrew poetry, and so there's parallelism, so the two lines are sort of mirroring each other, and yet they're not absolutely identical. If they were absolutely identical, there wouldn't be any poetry in it. If they were just analytically identical, there wouldn't be any poetry and there wouldn't be any point. So it's given that there's some kind of subtle distinction. And so I think that when we look at this, we can kind of see that distinction. To turn away from evil is understanding. That is human understanding. That is what we need to understand as human beings. And then the fear of the Lord connects us with the absolute level. That is wisdom. So these are two ways of knowing. They're complementary, and then they can occur at the same time. The fear of the Lord. Obviously, this means awe and reverence, but it also carries some of the connotation of fear, of terror, right? Because the holy has this quality of overpoweringness, and it has this quality of being beyond good and evil. But we must remember that it grounds the good. It enables us to be just. It enables us to be compassionate. It enables us to be loving and to exercise all the virtues and create all the good things that we do within the world by giving us reality with all its good and evil, with its limitations, its finitude, its temporality. But by doing so, the ground of being, God, the Lord, gives us the ability to realize these goods with a lowercase g, and also allowing us to turn back to him and participate in, to some extent, though never completely, probably, participate in this fount of being, which he is. And so that's that. So when we say deliver us from evil, we have this awareness that evil will not be entirely eradicated, and yet we're orienting ourselves in the right way in relation to it. And we're asking what we very, very naturally and understandably and commendably ask as human beings, which is, may we not suffer evil. And in that way, again, we're bringing ourselves in relationship to God the Father, and through this form or this manifestation of God the Father, the absolute sort of ineffable ground of being itself. Finally, this is the last slide, and I just wanted to very briefly touch on a question that might come up for some people watching us, which would be, well, GP, how much of this is just your unique interpretation, and how much of it is what's actually in the prayer as Jesus spoke it, as Jesus taught it and intended it? And I think that's a fantastic question. And that's why I didn't call this sort of the correct interpretation of the real interpretation, or the secret interpretation of the prayer, but I called it a Vitalist nontheist interpretation of the prayer. I didn't say it's the real Christian interpretation either, but I really wanted to distance it somewhat from that. What I will say in favor of the idea that this is not just completely pulled out of my own head is that these tensions really exist in the prayer. And they exist in monotheism in general. And so I would see this, what I'm doing is partly an explication or an elaboration of these pre-existing tensions. We've already talked about how Jesus prayed in the garden before he was crucified, take this cup away from me, but not what I will, but what you will. And this shows this inherent tension here. How does the evil that exists in the world relate to the ground of being? And if the ground of being is personal, how do we say that they are completely benevolent, understood in a human way, and omnipotent at the same time? And I think that the way we can break through that is by understanding that ultimately it's non-personal. And there's no malice there. And yet they appear in this form, and we can relate to them in this form, and that form is holy. And so that form kind of hovers above good and evil, as holiness hovers above the moral good. But I wanted to bring in one passage from Scripture. So Luke and Acts, which I've read recently, and in other books of the New Testament as well, but I'm just thinking of Acts and Luke because that was what's fresh in my mind, often talks about how this was foreordained, the crucifixion of Christ was foreordained by God, and yet that's often in a conscious tension, like an explicit tension with the fact that men freely chose to do it. So for instance, in Luke 22, verse 22, it says, "For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. For determined, I've also seen a translation of decreed. The idea is that God determined it beforehand, and yet the verse is saying at the very same time, it's bad that the man who betrayed him, Judas, betrayed him. It was bad that he did that. So there's a sense in which it was completely willed by God, and there's a sense in which that man, Judas, fell short of his what he should have done, gravely short of what he should have done. And I think those two can exist in the same reality, but they are on different levels. Now, on the other hand, did Jesus think about it like this? I don't think that Jesus thought about it like this. I think that for many theists, not all theists, but many theists, it's kind of counterproductive to pull apart the ground of being aspect of God and the personal aspect of God. They cohere. Now, I do think that gives rise to certain paradoxes and certain logical contradictions if we take it fully seriously. But if we understand its practical utility, I think it doesn't matter, right? And so but I don't see evidence that Jesus saw it in the same way that I see it and would explicitly take it apart like this and say that we're relating to the impersonal ground of being through the personal form of God. But he simply would have seen God the Father, the Jewish God, the God of Israel, as being that ground of being and as being personal and as having a personal relationship with him, as well as potentially being him. Here's where we maybe go beyond theism, but nonetheless, having a personal relationship with him. And so I think that's probably the view of Jesus. And so I don't think Jesus would have shared this view. I also don't want to give the impression that somehow I think that I'm wiser than Jesus for developing that, because that would be absurd. And what I'm doing here is almost irrelevant. It's almost irrelevant. And if it doesn't bring me nearer to God and it doesn't make me a better person, it's at least irrelevant, if not counterproductive. The reason I'm sharing it is because I find it does bring me closer to God, and it does help me to be a better person, and it does enrich my prayer life. And that if there are people like me that have similar thoughts or a similar kind of orientation to things, then it could also help them to think this way. And if they don't have the same thoughts, at least it might stimulate them to think about things differently, and maybe to sort of think about things more deeply, even if they don't come to the same conclusions that I do. And so that's why I've said that. So Jesus probably wouldn't have agreed with my non-theism, and he probably wouldn't have agreed with what I've called my vitalism, which is that idea that this reality, this life as we know it, essentially is all that there is, because he did look toward the resurrection of the dead. He perhaps, maybe even probably, rose from the dead in a new kind of body, or a body that was able to do other things. And so, and as in the early Christians believed, and most Christians in history have believed, that is a sign of what's to come for everyone, and that the whole universe will be transformed. And so that would be saying, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," in a different way, or a more radical way than I see that phrase, which would be more close to "May earth be transformed into heaven," in the sense that the resistance and what we would call evil from our level in the world will be eradicated and completely overcome, and there will be only goodness. Now, that seems to be the view of Jesus, the way that he speaks in the Gospels, and it seems to be the view of the early, of the disciples, of the apostles, of the early church, and it's been enshrined in the creeds, and it's come down to us in our day. And so I recognize that the view that I'm putting forward is different to that. And someone might say, like, why, if I'm willing to give credence to the resurrection of Jesus, am I not just endorsing that idea that there is a different kind of reality beyond this one? First of all, I wouldn't say that I'm completely closed off to that. It's just that I can't conceive of it. Secondly, I would say that the resurrection of Christ doesn't in itself show us a different reality. It does show us a body risen from the dead. So that shows us that what we understand about physics and what we understand about biology and reality is not complete, or at least what we understand as possible in those realms is not complete. That a body could be dead, a person could be dead, and then they could come to life again. The second thing is that the risen Lord could do things that we can't do. He could sort of appear and disappear at will. He could take on a different appearance, apparently. Maybe he could ascend into heaven. Maybe the disciples experienced him actually rise from the earth towards heaven, towards the skies. But there's certainly a sense in which his bodily existence was transformed. Now, because I already believe in magic and miracles, I don't see this as being a huge challenge, and I don't see this as going beyond what is fundamentally this reality in this life. And it's interesting that Luke, for instance, again, because I've been reading Luke recently, emphasizes that he ate fish with his disciples after he was risen. So that implies the whole process of metabolism and digestion. Maybe it looks different, but it implies that that we are dealing with the same reality. And Luke emphasizes that he was flesh and blood, or flesh and bone. And so that's what I would say about that. It doesn't in itself elucidate for us how we could have an eternal life, and how we could have a universe or a life without suffering, without negativity. And so those are the two things I'd say about that I am open to that. So there's not necessarily like a hard, like I said, we don't know how far goodness could increase. We don't know what's possible. Because there may be things, there may be modes of being, and there may be phenomena that we've never experienced before, and so we have no way to understand, and so we just don't know. But in terms of what we do know, this is the realm in which we inhabit. This is how we think of things. This is how we imagine things. So this is what we have to work with. And so within that realm, that's why I would say that I'm a vitalist in this peculiar sense that I'm using here, which is to say, it needs to concern this life. It needs to concern this reality. And this is what we have to work with. And this life, for us, is inherently finite. And so that would be another area in which Jesus would probably disagree with me. And my comfort is that all the different prophets, saints, sages, and ways that God manifests himself to us often disagree on particular doctrines like this, even though they're speaking from the same ultimate reality, let's say, or the same ultimate ground of being. The final thing I'll say, though, that is that understanding this probably wasn't the view that Jesus had. This is why I would say it's an exaptation of the prayer. So exaptation is a term that it basically means something that's evolved for one purpose is sort of taken over or used for another purpose. And so one example is like the human tongue. So the tongue exists to taste food so we don't poison ourselves. And it also exists to kind of maneuver food around the mouth and stop us from choking. Those are the main reasons that sort of evolutionarily it's there, and yet we use it for speaking. It didn't evolve for speaking. At some point our ancestors didn't speak, but eventually we developed the ability to speak, and now I'm using my tongue to do what I do now. It's been exapted. It evolved for one purpose and it's exapted for another. It was developed for one purpose, but it got exapted for another. So this is kind of what I would see myself as doing with this prayer as well. There's a degree to which the things I'm noticing are in the prayer, but there's an extent to which I'm taking the prayer and I'm using it for my own purposes. Now, I hope those purposes are good purposes and conducive to goodness and wisdom, but they're my particular purposes. They're my particular worldview, my particular understanding, and I'm not claiming that they're Christian. I don't think that they can claim the label of being Christian, and I don't think that ultimately they're how Jesus would have articulated things either. And so that's just my disclaimer, and that's my understanding of the prayer. If you have any comments or thoughts, I would love to hear them. If you want to comment below, or if you feel like anyone else might find this video interesting or helpful, please share it. But otherwise, thank you for listening.